My presentation is on Learning Objective 6 of Class 15, and it states, discuss the factors that regulate the cardiac output, which are heart rate, preload, contractility, and afterload. So cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle for unit of time. In a normal person, their cardiac output is usually about 5 liters per minute. The equation for cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So we can start by looking at heart rate. Heart rate is measured in beats per minute and is regulated by the SA node in the heart, which is the heart's pacemaker. The two main factors that regulate heart rate are the autonomic nervous system and certain chemicals. So the autonomic regulation has to do with sympathetics and parasympathetics. Sympathetic stimulation causes an increase in heart rate by releasing norepinephrine, and parasympathetic stimulation of the SA node causes a decrease in heart rate by releasing acetylcholine. So looking further into the sympathetic innervation, you can see that the sympathetics increase the rate of spontaneous depolarization of the funny channels, allowing the threshold for an action potential to be reached more quickly. As a result, the SA node fires action potentials at a higher frequency and heart rate increases. Looking at parasympathetic innervation, the parasympathetic stimulation of the SA node decreases heart rate by decreasing the rate of spontaneous depolarization in the SA node cells, so the threshold for action potentials is reached more slowly. The chemical regulation of heart rate has to do with things like hormones, ions, and drugs. So hormones like norepinephrine and epinephrine enhance the heart's pumping effectiveness. So things like exercise, excitement, or stress, or any activities that you can feel your heart increasing, usually has to do with the innervation of hormones. Ions are important for the establishment of gradients, which, as we know, are crucial for conducting action potentials. Drugs can also increase heart rate. An example of one that decreases would be adenosine, and one that increases would be atropine. Next, we can look at stroke volume. So stroke volume is a volume of blood ejected by the ventricles during each contraction. The equation for stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood the ventricle contains at the end of its relaxation period, which is during the diastole, so right before it is going to contract. And the end systolic volume is the volume of blood remaining in the ventricle at the end of the contraction, or systole. Stroke volume is regulated by three things, which are preload, contractility, and afterload. So preload is the degree of stretch on the heart before it contracts, or the volume of blood entering the ventricles, and this is your end diastolic volume. The greater the preload on the cardiac muscles prior to contraction, the greater the force of contraction, and therefore the greater the stroke volume. And this is based on the Frank-Starling law of the heart, which states that the greater end diastolic volume, the more forceful the next contraction will be. So quickly we can look at where this is based upon, which is the length tension curve. And as you can see, as the end diastolic volume increased, the optimal length of the sarcomeres was reached, and we want that optimal length so that the sarcomeres are overlapping at the optimal length, so that the greatest force of contraction can be made, and that will increase your stroke volume. And the two determinants of EDV are filling time and venous return. So filling time is the duration of ventricle diastole. So the time it takes for the ventricles to fill. And if there's a shorter filling time, this means there'll be a smaller end diastolic volume, and the ventricles may contract before they are adequately filled. In venous return is the volume of blood returning to the right ventricle. And when venous return increases, a greater volume of blood will flow into the ventricles, and therefore the EDV will increase. Next, we can look at contractility. And contractility is the strength of contraction at any given preload. And agents that alter contractility are said to have an inotropic effect. So we can have positive inotropes, which will increase contractility, and these will usually be your sympathetics. Negative inotropes will decrease contractility, and these are usually sympathetic inhibitors or parasympathetic. And stroke volume increases when contractility increases. The last factor that affects stroke volume is afterload. And afterload is the resistance the ventricles must overcome to circulate blood and push that blood out of the ventricles. An increase in afterload will cause a decrease in stroke volume because more blood will remain in the ventricles at the end of systole. Certain conditions that increase afterload include hypertension, vasoconstriction, which is the narrowing of the arteries, because this will increase blood pressure and increase the pressure the heart has to push against in order to eject this blood. So in conclusion, factors that can increase cardiac output are heart rate, preload, and contractility. So as these factors increase, we will increase our cardiac output. Increases in afterload, however, will decrease cardiac output because less blood will be ejected from the heart. So if we take a look at this flow chart, we can just review really quickly the different factors. So you can split this up into heart rate and stroke volume. You multiply these two together and you get cardiac output. Factors that affect heart rate are autonomic innervation, like the sympathetics and parasympathetics, hormones, drugs, ions, and those different chemicals. Factors that affect stroke volume can be broken down to preload, contractility, and afterload. Preload determines the end diastolic volume, and this end diastolic volume is determined by venous return and filling time. Contractility has to do with how forceful the contraction can be, how much blood can be pushed out in that one contraction. And this is affected by autonomic innervation, like the inotropes, the positive and negative ones. And this also determines the end systolic volume. Afterload is that force the heart has to push against in order to eject the blood. An increase in afterload will decrease cardiac output. And things that can affect afterload are vasodilation, vasoconstriction, hypertension, things that will change the blood pressure. So when you get those, you subtract end systolic volume from end diastolic volume, get your stroke volume, multiply that by your heart rate, and you'll get your cardiac output, usually measured in liters per minute. So thanks.